Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. Something that came directly from you guys. We got a transcript from you of a recent Candace Owens YouTube episode. And right away, something kind of jumped out at us.
Yeah.
There was this idea that kept coming up over and over again about what we're told versus what's really going on, and it made us think about how many public figures and public events might have like hidden layers that we don't always see.
Right. Yeah.
So what we're going to do today is really dig into this transcript and try to pull out those themes of political disillusionment, the way that information gets shaped and presented to us, and the possibility that there might be some hidden agendas at work that we don't know about.
Yeah.
And we know that, this is something that you guys are interested in, too, based on, you sending this to us. And we're always looking for that more complete picture, right? The stuff that's kind of below the surface.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're going to dive in and see what we can uncover together.
Yeah.
What really got our attention in this transcript was the way that Candace Owens talks about this idea of a political pivot. She's very, very clear that she doesn't think her views have really changed, even though some people might think that based on her recent content or the guests that she's had on her show. But the part that really resonated with us was her frustration with the whole left versus right framework. We always talk about politics in those terms. She kind of suggests that this division is actually a distraction.
Right. Yeah.
It keeps our attention on these more superficial arguments and disagreements while there's a much deeper dynamic at play, maybe even something sinister that's going on in Washington, D.C., and we're not really paying attention to it because we're so focused on the left and the right.
Yeah, she seems to be implying that there's something much bigger going on that both sides are kind of in on, and that we're not being told the full story, or that we're missing something. And I think that's an idea that a lot of people kind of gravitate towards, because we see so much happening in politics that doesn't appear to make sense on the surface.
Right. It's like there's this feeling that the game is rigged somehow, that the rules are different for those who are already in power. And that connects directly to something that Dave Smith said in a clip that Candace played during her episode. He talked about how politicians, no matter what they say during their campaigns, they often seem to completely pivot once they're actually in office. It's like they make all these promises to get elected, and then once they're in, their priorities totally change. And you can really feel that sense of frustration in her voice when she talks about it. And it echoes, I think, a feeling that a lot of us have, right? It's like, why aren't the people we voted for following through on what they said they would do? What is it about being in power that makes people change like that?
Yeah, it's almost like a bait and switch, You get sold one thing, and then you get something completely different. And I think that leads to a lot of cynicism and distrust in the political system as a whole.
Right. And if we take that feeling of unmet expectations and that kind of like distrust, and we apply it to a broader perspective, it makes us start to look at other narratives with a little bit more skepticism, right? And it makes us look for those inconsistencies, and that's exactly what starts to happen when the conversation turns to RFK Jr.
Yeah, exactly. The RFK Jr. situation is a really interesting one, because I think on the surface, it appears to be a pretty big shift. And what we're talking about here is this apparent change in his stance on vaccines. So, for a long time, he was a very vocal critic of vaccine safety. He was involved with Children's Health Defense, and he even wrote a book in 2021, the Measles book, that had a really strong statement in it about how vaccines are a cash cow for pharmaceutical companies, and that they've kind of abandoned genuine public health concerns in pursuit of profit. But then, fast forward to today, and he's on X as Secretary Kennedy, and, he's tweeting about sending CDC teams to Texas to actually increase MMR vaccination efforts.
Right. So it's like a complete 180. And the timing is really important here, right?
Yeah.
Because, like you said, the book came out pretty recently, so it's not like this was some ancient opinion that he had.
Yeah.
He was actively promoting this view just a couple of years ago, and now it's like he switched sides entirely. And that leads to a really big question. How does someone with that kind of history, that consistent skepticism on this particular issue, suddenly become a proponent? What could possibly account for that kind of dramatic change?
Yeah, I mean, people do change their minds over time. It's not unheard of. But this does seem like a pretty significant shift in position, especially given his history and his strong stance on this issue in the past.
Right, and it's not just like he softened his stance a little bit. It's like he's gone to the complete opposite end of the spectrum. And here's where things get kind of interesting. The transcript starts talking about this theory, and it's important to say that this is totally unconfirmed. It's just speculation at this point. But they start talking about blackmail as a possible explanation for this shift. And apparently this was something that was being discussed within Candace Owens's circle. They mentioned Jessica Reed Krause as being aware of these discussions. And the suggestion is that there might be some damaging information out there about RFK Jr. that could be used to pressure him into changing his stance.
Yeah, and I mean that kind of speculation really gets to, like the heart of what we're talking about here.
Right.
Which is that, we want to believe that the people that we see in the public eye are being genuine with us.
Right.
That they're not being manipulated or coerced into saying things that they don't believe.
Yeah.
But the reality is that, we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes, and it's entirely possible that there are forces at play that we're not aware of.
Right. And it makes you wonder how many other public figures might be in similar situations. Are they saying what they truly believe, or are they being influenced by something or someone that we don't know about?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something to think about. It's kind of a disturbing thought, but I think it's important to at least consider the possibility.
Okay, so let's go even deeper down the rabbit hole here.
Right.
The transcript then moves on to another really prominent individual, Benjamin Netanyahu. And this is where things start to get really surprising.
Yeah.
They bring up this article from 1996 from the Washington Report on Middle Eastern Affairs, and this article makes some pretty shocking claims. It says that Netanyahu has used multiple names: Benjamin Netanyahu, Benjamin Netai, John J. Sullivan, and even John J. Sullivan Jr. And it claims that some of these names were linked to a Malibu address that apparently doesn't even exist.
Oh, wow.
Right. It's like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And the article goes on to explain that his name was legally changed from Netanyahu to Nitai back in 1973. And there's documented evidence for that.
Right.
But these other two names, John J. Sullivan and John J. Sullivan Jr., those are described in the article as being a complete mystery. And to add to all of this, they talk about finding credit approval requests under his Social Security number, each one listing a different name.
So it's like he was using these aliases for some purpose, but it's not clear what that purpose was.
Right. And then it gets even weirder. They tried to investigate his credit account, and it was empty.
What?
There was no record of any loans or debts or any of the usual financial activity. It was almost as if he'd never participated in, the normal financial system. But the really crazy detail is that, according to the article, his U.S. Social Security file had a confidential classification. And this is something that's usually only applied to people who work for agencies like the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, or people who are considered to be, terrorists or criminals.
Oh, wow. So that's some pretty serious stuff. Right.
I mean, it almost sounds like he's got some kind of secret past that he's trying to keep hidden.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, if this is true, what else are we not being told about?
Yeah, I mean, if a major political figure can have these kind of secrets in their past, it really makes you wonder about the whole system.
Yeah.
It's like, who can we trust? Who's really pulling the strings?
And that's what makes these kinds of deep dives so fascinating, right?
Right.
Because it's like we're peeling back the layers of what's presented to us and trying to see what's underneath.
Yeah.
Okay, so from these questions about hidden identities in politics, the transcript then kind of pivots to Hollywood and this idea of propaganda and hidden influence. And they start by talking about Harley Pasternak, and they mention that it's really hard to find information about him, which immediately raises red flags. And they talk about an alleged connection to Canadian government mind experiment programs, and that immediately brings to mind MKUltra.
Right. That really creepy CIA project that was all about mind control experiments.
Yeah, that's scary stuff.
And they bring up this anecdote about Walter Pasternak. And this Walter Pasternak was allegedly a CIA agent who was involved in MKUltra. And they say that there are no publicly available photographs of him.
Oh, wow.
Which, if you think about it, is really strange. Because we live in a world where pretty much everyone has some kind of digital footprint, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that someone who is allegedly involved in such a sensitive and controversial program has, no trace online, that makes you wonder if there's something being hidden, if they're intentionally trying to obscure his history.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes you think.
And then they go on to talk about this historical example of the CIA's involvement with the book Dr. Zivado during the Cold War. And they used this book as a form of propaganda to try to influence public opinion. And this leads to a broader discussion about whether Hollywood itself might be functioning as a kind of propaganda machine. Like, think about it. The Pentagon has an actual office that's dedicated to film production.
Yeah. I mean, it's no secret that the government have been involved in Hollywood for a long time.
Right. And it makes you wonder how many of the stories and narratives that we consume through movies and TV shows might be shaped or influenced in ways that we're not even aware of.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something to be aware of. I think, as consumers of media, we need to be critical of what we're watching and reading and try to think about the messages that are being sent to us.
And this whole idea of skepticism toward mainstream narratives is something that carries over into a discussion about how the media reports on specific events.
Yeah.
And they start with the case of George Floyd. And the transcript presents Candace Onens' perspective, which is that the full arrest tape and certain details about the incident weren't widely reported.
Oh.
Like, they mentioned that his girlfriend was reportedly calling him mama, and that detail wasn't really talked about in the mainstream media.
Oh, interesting.
And they suggest that drug abuse was a more significant factor in his death than was initially reported.
Oh, okay.
And that the media kind of focused on this narrative of division, black versus white, instead of focusing on a potentially unifying issue like addiction, which could have brought people together.
Yeah, it's interesting how the media can choose to focus on certain aspects of a story and ignore others, and that can really shape the public's perception of what happened.
Right. And it makes you wonder, how often does that happen? How often are we only getting a partial picture of events?
Yeah.
And the transcript then shifts to the Harvey Weinstein case, and they emphasize this claim that a lot of the allegations that were publicized outside of the courtroom didn't actually lead to convictions. And this was because of inconsistencies in the testimonies and the fact that some accusers couldn't accurately describe him physically. They mention a specific physical characteristic that some of the accusers didn't seem to be aware of. And the point that they're making is that a really powerful media narrative can take hold and be widely accepted even if the actual legal outcomes don't really support that narrative.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that happen in a number of cases where the media kind of creates a narrative, and then it becomes very difficult to challenge that narrative, even if there's evidence that contradicts it.
And it kind of goes back to that idea of selective reporting, right?
Right.
What details are being emphasized and what details are being left out? How does that shape our understanding of events?
Exactly.
Now get this. The conversation in the transcript then takes a really unexpected turn, and they start talking about Miss Rachel, who is a very popular children's YouTube personality. And she's facing some pretty serious accusations from groups like Stop Antisemitism and the New York Post for supposedly spreading Hamas propaganda.
What?
And it all stems from her expressing concern for children in Gaza.
Oh, wow.
And there are people calling for the Attorney General to investigate her, and they're suggesting that she might be receiving Qatari funding for her content.
Oh, so they're saying that she's basically a mouthpiece for Qatar.
Yeah, and the irony here is that earlier in the transcript, they were talking about allegations that Benjamin Netanyahu had received Qatari funding.
Oh, wow.
And they even mentioned an ongoing trial in Israel called Qatarate that's related to those allegations. But this trial has received very little attention in Western media.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it's like you have this children's entertainer who's being accused of promoting terrorism for expressing empathy for children in a war zone. And then you have a world leader who's facing allegations of receiving funding from a country that's often accused of supporting terrorism. And that story is barely being covered.
Yeah, it really does seem like there's a double standard at play here.
Right. And it makes you wonder, what are the criteria for determining which stories get amplified and which stories get ignored?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question, and I think it speaks to the power of the media to shape the narrative.
And it makes you wonder, are there other forces at play here? Like, are there certain interests that are benefiting from having some stories told and other stories suppressed?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible. I think, when we see these kind of discrepancies in how stories are covered, it's natural to start asking those questions.
And this whole discussion about selective narratives leads to an even bigger question, which is the influence of religious beliefs on geopolitical decisions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge topic.
Right. It's really complex.
Right.
But the transcript mentions this idea that some people believe that Benjamin Netanyahu has a specific role to play in ushering in the Messiah, and that this belief might be influencing their actions on the world stage.
Oh, wow.
And they even suggest that this belief might lead to a certain indifference towards casualties.
That's a pretty heavy idea.
It is, and it's something that, we could probably spend hours talking about.
Yeah.
But even this brief mention in the transcript really underscores the fact that there might be these really deep-seated ideological forces at play that we don't only see on the surface.
Yeah, and I think it's important to keep that in mind when we're trying to understand, the complexities of the world. It's not always as simple as it appears on the surface.
Right. And this deep dive is a perfect example of that, isn't it?
Yeah.
We started with a transcript of Candace Owens' episode.
Yeah.
And we've gone down all these different paths, from political disillusionment and vaccines to hidden identities and media narratives and even religious beliefs.
Yeah, it's amazing how these things are all interconnected.
Right. And it really paints this picture of a world where things are rarely straightforward. And there are all these layers of complexity and potential manipulation that we might not even be aware of if we're not paying close attention.
Yeah, I mean it's a lot to take in, but I think it's important to be aware of these things.
So what do we do with all of this information? What's a takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that, we need to be critical thinkers. We need to question the narratives that we're being given, and we need to be willing to do our own research and come to our own conclusions.
And I think the most important thing is to keep an open mind, right?
Yeah.
Because we might not always be right, and we need to be willing to change our minds when presented with new information.
Absolutely.
So for all of you listening, we challenge you to think about how these themes that we've discussed today, these ideas of hidden identities and manipulated narratives, and the potential disconnect between what we're told and what's really happening, how those themes might extend beyond the specific examples that we've talked about. Think about other areas of your life, the information that you encounter every day. What other rabbit holes, based on the insights from this deep dive, might be worth exploring with a more critical and questioning perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about becoming more aware of the forces that are shaping the world around us and not just accepting things at face value.
That's a great way to put it.
Thank you.
So that's the challenge we leave you with today. Thank you so much for providing this really fascinating source material and for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, this was a really interesting one.
It was.
And I hope that it's given our listeners some food for thought.
Keep questioning, keep researching, and most importantly, keep forming your own informed opinion.
Yeah, that's the key.
That's it for us today. See you next time.
See you next time.